Hello, welcome to this discussion of Chapter 9 of the Compendium, the International Community. We're going to talk about that and a little bit about the upcoming chapter, Chapter 10, Safeguarding the Environment, which is closely related to it. I'm going to run through this really quickly today because YouTube doesn't let you be on for too long. And I want you to have in front of you, if you could, the outline I gave you of this discussion and also the compendium itself. We'll read some passages, a few passages from the compendium as we go through the chapter. Let me say, first of all, why this chapter matters. Because I think for many people in the pew, the average Catholic, something as seemingly remote as international relations isn't a top priority. The Church says it ought to be. In fact, the Church says it ought to be, in some ways, the top priority. The one issue that most challenges our Christian consciences. It says in section 449 on page 194, the one issue that most challenges our Christian consciences. Let's look at that. Page 194. Right at the bottom of the page. At the beginning of the new millennium, the poverty of billions of men and women is the one issue that most challenges our human and Christian consciences. At least it should be, even though it seems sometimes so very remote from us. Even more remote, at least remote from what we believe, is what the Church thinks needs to happen to address the poverty that is literally at our doorstep if we remember our solidarity with people across the globe. In Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict said something that his critics found just absolutely astonishing. He said he favored a world governing authority with powers even stronger than those of the United Nations that could really take a firm hand to address international problems. For Catholics in the United States, that's quite a stretch. It's a hard sell to tell people why, even to explain to people why the Church thinks that. So I want to talk to you about what the Church thinks as we go through the chapter today. If you notice at the beginning of the chapter, the focus was on disunity, why people don't get along, why there are international disagreements. And the compendium takes it all the way back to the Tower of Babel. It says, in effect, our sinfulness is the reason for our disunity. But in Christ we are called to what? To communion. To communion, as it says in section 432 on page 186. If we're called to communion, that doesn't mean just communion with our countrymen. The Church teaches that national sovereignty is not absolute. National sovereignty is to be respected insofar as it's good for people, but it's not absolute. And in fact, people don't even see it as absolute. We recognize that there exists such a thing as international law, which is discussed on page 189, section 437, in which nations yield some of their sovereignty so that they can get along with their neighbors. The best example of this yielding of sovereignty on a worldwide scene, of course, is the United Nations. And for many Catholics, and especially many Catholics who think of themselves as very faithful Catholics, the United Nations is not, let's say, our favorite organization. People say, the UN is into so much stuff that's against the teachings of the Church. There's all these bureaucrats who are trying to, ram stuff down people's throats. And yet the Church has been very supportive of the United Nations, and in the compendium expresses that support, and in fact suggests that we need an international authority of some kind of international agreements that go beyond what the United Nations is expected to do today. Why? What is this supposed universal public authority supposed to do? This chapter mentions three particular things that I would like you to look at very closely. First of all, we need international agreements, either through some authority beyond the United Nations or through the diplomatic channels that now exist. We need to promote international agreements to limit warfare. Secondly, we need to better regulate the global economy. And thirdly, and this is the thing that Compendium pushes the hardest, and it's the thing that perhaps seems most remote to us, we need to promote international development, to lift people out of poverty, or really to enable people to lift themselves out of poverty, which reflects the Church's teaching. Let's look at each one of these. First of all, we need some kind of international agreement, and preferably a strong international authority, to limit warfare. If you look on page 189, section 438, the Compendium talks about that. It says, to resolve the tensions that arise among different political communities and can compromise the stability of nations and international security, it's indispensable to make use of common rules and a commitment to negotiation, and to reject definitively the idea that justice can be sought through recourse to war. We're going to talk about war when we get to chapter 11. That's a pretty strong statement, and that's what international authority is supposed to do. It's what the United Nations is supposed to do. And to some extent, it's worked because we haven't destroyed our planet yet, but we certainly haven't prevented wars since the United Nations was established. And that's why we need stronger agreements and stronger authority with real police powers, in the Church's view, to keep national ambitions in check. And that's just not somebody else's international ambitions. That's the kind of international ambitions that we ourselves occasionally express through warfare. Secondly, to regulate the economy. Page 191, the Compendium talks about the global economy and the fact that global economy stretches beyond the boundaries of any one nation and beyond the capability of any one government to regulate what's going on. And so, in the interests of people who are often victimized by the global economy, we need some kind of stronger international authority to regulate the economy and prevent the kind of abuses that take place through international corporate power that is essentially unchecked. That's the second step. And thirdly, we need to promote development. Let's look on page 193, section 446. The Church says there's a temptation to think underdevelopment in the world, this great poverty that exists in the third world, or in the developing world, we call it sometimes, even though it isn't, is impossible to eliminate, as though it were a death sentence, because it speaks to structural change that would have to occur on a massive level, and it seems undoable. However, we say in the very next paragraph, these difficulties must be met with strong and resolute determination, because development is not only an aspiration, but a right that, like every right, implies a duty on the part of those who have to make sure that those who are not enjoying that right can exercise it, the right to development. And to what end? To the end of eliminating this kind of international poverty that exists, that holds people down. Not eliminating it by going in and giving people charity, just more and more and more endless aid that is often eaten up by corruption, but by finding pathways so that people can develop their own potential. In fact, this chapter at the end ties international development to all of the major points of Catholic social teaching. If you look on page 195, again in section 449, the section where it says that the big problem, the main problem that ought to be eating at our conscience is international poverty. It says on page 195, the fight against poverty finds a strong motivation in the option of the preferential love of the Church for the poor. In the whole of her social teaching, the Church never tires of emphasizing certain fundamental principles. First and foremost, the universal destination of goods. The fact that God gave the world for the enjoyment of all people, and not just us and not them. Constantly reaffirming the principle of solidarity. The Church's social doctrine demands action to promote the good of all and of each individual, because we are responsible for all. This principle must be appropriately accompanied by that of solidarity, not just leave them to stew in their own juice, which is what some people misinterpret solidarity to mean, or subsidiarity rather to mean, but subsidiarity that means participation, so that people recapture the spirit of initiative and enjoy the opportunity to develop themselves, so that the poor become and are seen not as a problem, but as people who can become the principal builders of a new and more human future for themselves. And that's what we teach about what international authority has to be about, and that's what we call for, a much stronger set of international agreements and a much stronger international political authority than currently exists in the United Nations. The problems the poor face are especially evident when you think how closely many people in the world live to the natural environment, and how easily whole towns are wiped out by things that here in this country we could easily fend off, like, say, flooding. The Church in the chapter on safeguarding the environment speaks to the harmful effects of environmental destruction on the poor in a really, really good section on page 209, section 482, where it calls to mind something that reminded me of the floods here in Atlanta, where the people who were hardest hit were poor people living in trailer parks. People who were better off got out of the way, but the poor could not do that. They're too close to nature. What are we supposed to do to protect the environment against rapacious development? Well, the Church advises steering a kind of middle course between that rapacious development on the one hand and the temptation that a lot of people feel to regard people as an intrusion on the natural environment and just in effect deify the natural environment. There's a really good discussion about those extremes on pages 201 through 204, where we wind up saying what we favor is stewardship of the environment, not simply so that we can enjoy it ourselves, but so that all people in the world can take advantage of the natural resources to develop themselves and protect those resources for their children and their grandchildren and for the future. The chapter on safeguarding the environment points out that the environment is one of those goods that cannot be adequately safeguarded or protected by market forces, as it says on page 205. And for that reason, the Church supports international regulation in the interest of environmental protection. But international regulation would be only one part. The other part would be an end to the logic of consumption. It says endlessly produce things we don't need, so that we can enjoy more than could possibly benefit us. This is something people say, oh, I could do that. I could live a simpler life. What can we do about things like international kinds of concerns? A simpler life by people in America might in some indirect way influence the welfare of people in other countries. How can we otherwise work, and through our parishes particularly, for the welfare of people in other countries, aside from what we encourage our government to do? Or how could we encourage our government to work for international accords that are in keeping with the teachings of the Church? We're going to talk about that when we come back, when we have Cullen Larson visit us from Catholic Relief Services. Meantime, you have some questions to do about Chapter 10, Safeguarding the Environment, and I will look forward to seeing you when our class resumes on October the 9th. Thank you very much for listening to this video.